Hey everyone, my name is Carlos. I'm the founder and CEO of Product School. And today I am with the VP of Product at Figma, which is one of my favorite products of all time, Yuki Yamashita. Hey Yuki,
Hi, Carlos. How's it going?
thank you for joining the show. You have no idea how many product people have requested to have Figma.
That's really awesome to hear. Thank you for having me.
So I can't wait to dig on into your personal story on how you broke into product, how you're thinking about the future of product, and how all of this trend of tools can empower more product people to create stuff. So let's start from the beginning. Why don't you tell us a
Okay.
little more about yourself and how you got into product?
Yeah. I was thinking a little bit about that, and I think I really got started in publication design a long time ago, mostly in school. And I was doing yearbooks, magazines, newspapers. I think probably one of the most formative experiences was being the designer on the newspaper for our college newspaper, and just being there kind of every night at the very end when everyone has written articles and trying to fit everything on on a piece of paper and doing lots of layouts and visualizations and things like that. So I think like a lot of my background has been in that design area. And then simultaneously, in college, started learning about computer science and started to see the intersection of computer science and design in the form of product. So whether it's just projects that we was doing, or things, side projects I was working on, that's when I kind of started to really stumble upon this discipline of product management that was trying to think about the user, think about product design, think about shipping things and learning. And that's kind of how, yeah, I stumbled upon the discipline. And out of college, I applied to Microsoft, got rejected once, but on my second time round, I got an offer, and that's how I got started in product management.
Well, they're probably picking out their hairs right now.
Yeah, well,
So, and then why Figma? Like, what's the backstory, right? Because at some point you have
yeah.
different options. Like, what was the backstory from like meeting the founder and deciding to join the team when it was pretty much an idea?
Yeah. Well, a number of years back, I was at Uber. That was where I was previous to Figma, and I was working on a big redesign of our app for drivers. And as part of that, we were experimenting with different products, and we found Figma. And we thought it would be a great way to just keep everyone in the loop of what's happening and the latest designs and things like that. And yeah, no, we really loved the product. We got to see it spread within the company, and also transform the product development culture at Uber. So by the time kind of Figma reached out to me, I was already really sold on the product. And personally, I really just love how it's blurring the boundary between product, design, and all these other functions, and just bringing so many more people into the design process. And that was something that I could really get behind. So that was what excited me about joining.
So I want to double click on the last part that you said about non-designers using your product,
Yeah.
because I think that's really powerful. When I started my career, so also come from a computer science background, I didn't know anything about design, and
Hmm.
and opening in Photoshop was very intimidating to me.
Right,
So
right, right.
I see now this opportunity for non-designers to really be powerful enough
Yeah.
with this type of visual tool. So tell me more about the different user personas that you see using Figma, and what are some of the main use cases.
Yeah. Well, I mean, especially for the non-designer, I would say kind of the primary use case is that people can think of is, a designer and engineer working together, for example, and an engineer kind of giving feedback on certain parts of the design, or they're trying to implement the design, and there's just a lot of things that are maybe underspecified, or maybe in code as they're building something, they realize that they actually need to tweak the designs because it's not quite working. And that back and forth is probably one of the most common use cases, as designers and engineers are working together. But even earlier than that, I think designers, engineers, PMs just iterating on a bunch of different designs, trying a few things out, prototyping, putting it in front of users. These are all things that Figma enables. And the whole idea is that it's all kind of done in an open. When you're opening up a file, it's a source of truth, so there isn't confusion around is this V1, V2, and so that's those are some of the use cases. But I think more and more we're seeing that we're seeing some of these use cases go from people just leaving comments and having conversations to actually people getting into the designs, maybe kind of duplicating the design and putting it on the side and kind of riffing on top of it. And that's one way to give feedback, to be like, oh, how about a design that looks like this? And that's something that we see a lot of non-designers starting to do, which is nice.
We define product management as the intersection with different groups. Engineering, design, business are key ones. So in your own experience, how have you seen that relationship between product and design evolve over time?
Yeah. I mean, I think that I've always been one to be pretty resistant to a very hard line between them. Oftentimes, depending on their skill sets, they have very kind of overlapping skill sets and responsibilities. And I think over time, what we're seeing is a lot of convergence. And this is not just product design; it's also with engineering. I think all the kind of skills and capabilities are being de-obfuscated, meaning everyone can participate. People can know a little bit of code, or engineers know a little bit of design, or designers know a little bit of how to do, frame a problem like a PM. So that's kind of, I think, the world we're getting towards, where things are starting to overlap a little bit versus, a world where it was very specialized and full of just like handoffs. And I think that's really important because that's what allows us to move really fast. But it can be really confusing too, because, it means that, responsibilities are a little bit more blurred. And I think for me, what's important is to kind of lean into that. And maybe you have like a framework that says that a product manager is accountable for getting something done, but they might not be the people who do it. So for example, a user story, we all know you have to write a user story, but maybe it's a designer, maybe it's a PM, it doesn't matter, but making sure that who's accountable for making sure it gets done. That's kind of how I start to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, this whole field is evolving so much, right? There are a lot of questions about what is product management, what is product design, why do we need product? So, in general, what are some of those myths and misconceptions that you hear?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest misconception I think that I've heard is just this idea that it's a really clean, linear process. And I think you read about this a bunch, like maybe it's a double diamond process, or anything out there where there are these discrete steps where you kind of go along this journey of getting a product developed. And I think that the reality is actually not linear. So for example, I'll give you two examples. One is kind of like design principles. There's this idea that maybe you can kind of like define design principles first and then design the thing. And that way you can kind of like make sure you're kind of following your principles as you design. But I think anyone who's gone through that process knows that actually only until you start designing do you realize if these principles are even useful for helping making decisions, that you go back and actually change some of your principles after the fact. Or similarly, I think like there's a really good practice of saying kind of like, let's define the problem first, right? And then actually figure out the solution, which is the right thing to do. But actually, in reality, a lot of people come up with a solution or idea first, and then like you kind of back out of that and figure out what the problem might be. And so it's kind of, that is the process always kind of works like that. And I think you just have to lean into that versus think that it's the wrong way to do things.
That's a good point, right? Because there's so many books and frameworks, and they're only as good as how you actually use them and your team believes in them. So when people come to us asking about what type of agile methodology should we follow, should we do Scrum or Kanban? And I don't know, maybe none of them. Maybe it's your own, right? Like maybe it's more about understanding the principles that are important for your company. I've seen companies that use different methodologies depending on their group.
Right, for sure.
So in your own experience, you obviously broke into product. You talked about your passion for publishing, literally physical newspapers and content, and then your passion for engineering. I guess that helped you kind of break into product. But then how does someone go from product manager all the way up to VP of product? What are some of the skills that served you well?
Yeah, I think that I think of two really important skills that I think are important for any product manager. One is storytelling, and the other is this framework thinking. And so for storytelling, it's kind of like, you know, whatever you're really trying to do, whether it's internally or externally, what you're trying to do is tell a story. and you're trying to tell a story about how a problem is now easier to, has been addressed through this particular solution. And internally, you might have to motivate why the problem is the most important thing to work on in the first place, and then also motivate why this particular solution is the best solution. And when people kind of like understand that story, then it really unlocks them to just go and, contribute to it and do their best work. And for users too, when you're launching a bunch of features, if they don't fit into the story, it's hard for them to know where you're headed. And oftentimes, I think even in the product management discipline, we always talk about kind of like why it's important not to just talk about features, and features aren't the only currency. And the reason people choose you as a product isn't just because of the features you have, but because they believe in the direction you're taking and the philosophy you have. And if you can't tell a story around it, you have no idea where this product could be going and whether you really want to invest in it. So that's kind of like number one in terms of storytelling, both externally for your customer, but internally to motivate your teams and to really rally them. And then I think the second one is framework thinking. I think, I think back to kind of like some classes like linguistics that helped me kind of understand this, where, at the end of the day, there's so much that's kind of like, um, you know, a lot of what you have to do as a product manager is to create a lens for looking at a problem. And it's kind of like words, right? Like words are trying to just discretize this like infinite space into like, a discrete number of things. Like a color spectrum becomes like a certain number of colors, or music turns into certain kind of music notes. And I think it's the kind of same for, product problems, for example, where my favorite example I give is that Uber, when, all the like our CEO Travis texted me all the time about all the problems he had with his pickup experience. And it's so easy to just think that all these are just different pickup problems and like pickups are broken. But if you can provide a lens that like actually the pickup problem looks like this, and there are 6 stages to it, and this stage is the most critical because that's where like most of our business metrics are tied. So we're going to focus on that instead of these other things. So when next time someone like Travis complains about a pickup, they can be like, oh, like that is in this bucket, which is not important right now. And if you disagree with that, great, like let's talk about that. But it gives people a way to think about kind of the problem so that, you can organize how how your roadmaps or organize how you think.
Well, the story you shared about Travis reminds me of so many other stories I hear from CEOs, myself included, right? That most of us come from a product background, so we are very passionate and opinionated about our own products, right? And when the CEO has a problem, it's very easy to believe that that's the number one priority.
Yeah.
Or maybe because the CEO lives in San Francisco, that is also a representation of many other CEOs or many other people, which is really hard to believe that that's the case. So how do you go about really prioritizing what you think it's the right thing to do next?
Yeah. I mean, it's it's always kind of an art, but I mean, at the end of the day, I think that it's really important for you to first feel like you have all the context necessary. And some of it is your existing users who are telling you what they want. Some of it is your prospective users where you have to go and find them and see what they might need because they're not talking to you right now. Right. And some of it might be kind of these macro climate economic or kind of like higher level things that are happening outside or in the industry that are affecting you. So that could be like competition or where a certain technology is going. And like those things, like combined are what you need to have context around, or at least some assumptions around to really figure out kind of like what insights you want to actually operate on. And then as it relates to kind of like specifically what to do next, I mean, that's just like a question of strategy. And, I think it's also a question of like goals and like what goals really matter. And so for me, like it's always most important to kind of work through goals first. And you can sometimes often find that, you might have 4 or 5 goals that you're trying to achieve. But if you do the work, oftentimes you can show how each goal ladders up to the other. And that way you can better understand which one to really work on first, because it's the one that has the capacity to change your business the most. But it's definitely a hard task.
It is, especially as your team grows, where there are different product managers focused on different initiatives, and sometimes the goal of a specific initiative may diminish an overarching goal.
Yeah, for sure. That can happen, and that's tricky.
And I can imagine now you're building a platform and there are so many different use cases. Right? Probably you can think of some, but I'm sure people would surprise you with like, oh, we're using Figma for this and that. I
Yeah.
told you off camera, we've used Figma for creating birthday cards,
Yeah.
right? So how can you really create a platform to still empower people, surprise you, while making sure that that core user persona is still being satisfied with the product?
Yeah, yeah. It's a good question, and it's actually, just like you, I'm always surprised by all the use cases that people are using Figma for. People are doing kind of like their floor plans on Figma, or their resumes on Figma, and those aren't things that we necessarily we designed for. Um, I think that for us, it kind of starts with it still is important for us to have a good sense of what we think we're best at least from our perspective, what we want to be definitively best at is designing user interfaces. So that's kind of like our focus, and anything that makes that faster is great. And if as part of that we start supporting other use cases, that's wonderful, and we definitely don't want to get in the way of that. But we definitely have a laser focus around making sure that all the companies who are trying to build products and design products are getting the most they need. And that's kind of how we think about it right now. And I think over time we might have to start thinking a little bit, branching out a little bit more. But that's our exclusive focus right now.
And for your product team, how do you empower them to make sure that they also feel heard, that they can contribute to roadmap, and that they also have their own career path?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that in terms of feeling heard, I mean, I think the most important thing for when you're building a team is making sure that, with you have a relationship or a contract where it's really around goals. And so it's rather than saying, hey, go build this, it's go solve this problem where success is measured by this, and this is what you'll be held accountable to. And typically that's a lot of responsibility for that individual, but it's also empowering because then they can go decide whatever they need to do to achieve that goal. So I think like that's the way I try to think about it, instead of basically like making it really feel like they have to go build a very specific thing. um, and in terms of career path, I think especially kind of in a company where we're all growing, like the kind of hope is that we're growing so fast, and that kind of just by growing with the company, there's just a lot of opportunities that open up. And I think that's something that's happened. I've just been the lucky recipient of many times in my career, whether at Uber or Figma, where just because the product itself is growing and the surface area is getting bigger, like that itself is giving you a career path on its own.
Definitely. I mean, I can't imagine what it must be to be in this type of hyper growth mode, hiding, rearranging the org to try to, keep up with all the demand and the
Right.
different clients that you get. So you personally, how do you learn to be a VP and a people manager?
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of times, the inspiration comes from, your peers or your former managers. And I think that, you know, that's probably where I get most of, my source. Those are my sources for learning how to be a better manager, what they did well, what they did poorly, and learning from that. Um, but I think it definitely depends on the team dynamics for sure. And I think one of the things that you just have to be conscious of when you're leading an organization is understanding all the ways in which you can make the team more effective, and really picking the pieces that matter. So, for example, maybe it is that right now process is what matters the most, and that's where you need to focus. Or maybe it is right now that there's a particular part of the product area that's ambiguous and you need to dive into. And so I think it's just picking the right thing, because this is no different, in fact, from just being an individual product manager, where I actually really believe the product manager always just has to kind of like fill in the gaps, right? And that's kind of like what I think I'm doing for the organization right now as well.
I'm curious to know how your day-to-day looks like. Is there any framework or like breakdown that you can share between meetings, work that you produce, and other
Yeah.
things you do?
Yeah. Well, many of my, or much of my calendar is just Zoom meetings right now for sure. I think that there's things that we think about. So obviously, there's just one-on-ones and ways in which we are right now trying to um, make up for the fact that we don't have kind of this serendipitous encounters in the office, right? And so making sure we spend a lot of time just like having talking with each other about a bunch of random topics. So like one-on-ones are actually a really important part of my my calendar. I think at Figma, one of my favorite ones is design crits. And so we have that 3 times a week for an hour, and people bring what they're working on. It's super generative. Everyone jumps into a Figma file. Often it's a silent meeting where we're just kind of like going in and like into the file and riffing off of it. So that's kind of like another thing. And then in terms of reviews, we try to have different kinds of reviews. Sometimes, you're reviewing the problem statement. Other times you're reviewing the solution. And, those are kinds of ways in which, we try to kind of create clarity around the purpose of the meeting. But honestly, a lot of it is meetings right now for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the job. And I'm curious about what you said, the design riffing. So I've never seen it before. How does it work? And how do you make sure that the highest paid person in the room is not influencing that meeting too much?
Yeah. I mean, I think the silent crit is what makes it really work well. So for example, what we do is we open up a Figma file. We have a bunch of post-its, kind of virtual post-its on the side, and people are just kind of like leaving post-its all throughout the design. And at the end, we get together and talk through it. But this way, a few things happen. One is, everyone's contributing at once. So, there's no notion of having to be called upon to give an opinion. And then secondly, you're able to see what other people are saying, and you can just kind of like latch onto that. So you see a lot of like, oh, I agree, or +1, or and those kinds of things. So you kind of like self-cluster. And I think it really is interesting just as a phenomenon because, oftentimes you don't have the opportunity to hear what everyone is thinking when, it's just when it's all kind of like someone actually has to speak up because only one person can speak at a time.
That's so cool. One of my favorite questions in the podcast I always ask to other product leaders is what's in their stack, right? Like what are the tools that they or their teams use? And
Yeah.
I have to be honest, like most of the product leaders that I've interviewed so far mentioned Figma. I was like, okay, I have to have you on the show. So now I ask you that question. Other than Figma, I guess you guys drink your own champagne, but what other tools are part of your stack?
Yeah. I mean, other than Figma, I mean, definitely try to use Figma for a lot of things. Like even all our presentations and slides are in Figma, and so that way, we're dog fooding our own product, and we're making the product better that way as well. And that's kind of like the forcing function for PMs to be using Figma a lot as well, because we PMs always make decks, right? Um, I think another interesting tool that we use is Coda. And so Coda is a tool that's kind of like it's kind of like spreadsheets meets docs. And one of the things that I do is track our roadmap there. And it's a tool that lets you build a lot of different ways to look at the same roadmap and a lot of different ways for people to update the roadmap so that we can always have one source of truth. But that's always the hardest part of any company in terms of process of figuring out what on earth is happening, what is like the latest status, and keeping everyone aligned around it without kind of like a lot of dreadful process. So that's been an important part of our kind of tool chain.
I remember those days where the roadmap was a PDF file that nobody could access. So in reality, nobody really knew what's going on. Now we see this new trend of low code or no code visual tools that empower people to co-create. And I think that's a huge shift.
Yes.
So I want to know, if you were to start over again, the younger Yuki, what would be the advice that you would give to yourself?
I think that maybe in the early days, I really defined success as coming up with a cool idea yourself, and like the good product manager has a lot of interesting ideas and they're putting it forth, and getting those implemented is what kind of being a good PM means. And I think over time you kind of realize that it's not that. And actually, success is more if you enable your team to come up with those ideas and you're the one equipping them with the context or motivating them with the problem to do that. And I think it's really important for two reasons. One is just like, as a PM, like you're, hopefully you're being a force multiplier and you're allowing a lot of diverse ideas to come to the table. And like that already is important. And another one is just, actually better things get built when, the people who are building feel like ownership over those ideas. And so, if like an engineer on your team or a designer on your team come up with an idea and they get really excited about it, you get really excited for them. That's when a lot of magic happens. And so I think, yeah, just shifting my mindset a little bit around just like the idea of, whose idea is it, and like not fixating on that is probably what I would want to tell my younger self.
It's been great to have you on the show. Thank you for your time. Is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I mean, I first of all, I enjoyed the chat. If people have, one of the things that we want to do at Figma is make the tool accessible to everyone, not just designers, and PMs are a big cohort of that. So if there are things that you can think of that make it better, or if there are problems that you're encountering, I'd definitely love to hear them.
You just open up the floodgates. Get ready. Okay, take care. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Carlos.